Hey everybody, Kevin McNulty here, host of Grow Yourself from the Inside Out. Thanks again for joining me for really a special episode, and it's special for a lot of different reasons, and you'll figure out in just a moment. So today we're going to talk about leadership, both from a self-leadership standpoint, but also from a more, organizational leadership. And this is something that I work with people. I coach on leadership and I speak about leadership. But I'll tell you, I'll recall actually many years ago, I was asked to come do, a workshop on leadership. And I asked, in preparation for it, I asked the potential client, what aspects of leadership do you want me to talk about? And it was odd, because this was a pretty well-known organization, that they kind of had this look in their eyes like, what do you mean? And I mentioned that I wanted to do a bit of an assessment. And again, I almost got pushed back. Well, we don't really need an assessment. I just want you to come and talk about being a better leader. And of course, as I'm sure most of you are thinking, well, leadership is such a broad concept that there are so many different aspects of leadership, if you will, that you can't really just come in and talk about this broad topic of leadership, unless you're just doing a keynote and offering some ideas. But the point is that leadership is comprised of so many different skills and characteristics and all those sorts of things. Well, having said that, my guest is a leader, and he has been a leader for a long time, but he brings really a very unique perspective to leadership, some of which many of you all will know and some of you not know. And so we are going to talk about various topics, various ideas relative to leadership, again, both leading yourself and others, but I would say from a very unique perspective. So my guest is Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Ingram. He's a retired Marine Special Operations Officer, which lends itself to a different style, different perspective, I guess you could say, about leadership. He served a 24-year career in the Marine Infantry, Reconnaissance, and Special Operations units, often in crisis or combat operations, and we're going to ask him about this. But more, he's a writer, he's a speaker, he's a storyteller, and has published articles in publications such as Task and Purpose and the Marine Corps Gazette. And I'm just not just looking forward to it, but I'm honored to have him today, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome to you Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Ingraham. Ivan, it's so good to have you here. I know that you are new to the private sector. I think you just retired about a month ago, and I've just got a lot of questions to ask. In any event, welcome to Grow Yourself from the Inside Out.
Well, Kevin, thank you very much. I'm really excited to be here. I'm humbled that you asked me to be here, and you are right. I have been a civilian. I'm a newly minted civilian after 1 month retired just on the 1st of February. So I'm pretty excited about that.
Well, because we talked about this earlier, that I also retired from the Air Force, and remember that transition in my life, going from, I tell people that I was in the military for 40 years because I grew up with a Special Forces dad, a Green Beret dad, and he did 26 years, and I often say I felt like I was more in the military growing up than when I actually joined the military. But in any event, it's a different world out here. So thank you for your service. Welcome to the private sector. And listen, would you mind just sharing with the audience a little bit about you? Where are you from? Where were you brought up? Just take us from then to now, and we'll get into some of the other ideas relative to your service and leadership and that sort of thing.
Sure. Originally from Silver Spring, Maryland. I was the son of an Army colonel who was actually an Army psychologist. That lent to its own interesting twists and turns growing up. And my mother was a tenured English professor. So grew up in a fairly intellectual household, but there was a high emphasis on adventure and exploration and learning how to think. So I think, started enjoying that independence at a young age. And I also think that my upbringing also allowed for a wider breadth of understanding on some levels that a lot of people don't get. And that's not to disparage other people's upbringing.
Sure.
It's really to say that mine was unique in that regard. So being an Army brat, I moved around a lot as a kid. Then my father worked at Walter Reed Army Medical Center and finished his career there. So I lived in the Washington, D.C. area.
Very interesting.
I then
Yes.
joined the Marine Corps in 1997, thinking that I was just going to be a 4-year stint to then improve my resume and become a federal law enforcement agent. That's really kind of what my desires were at the time. And just as I was looking to make that transition right around 2001, 9/11 occurred. So that's changed the optic on how I was going to approach that. And I decided to stay in the Marine Corps, and that ended up being very fortuitous and made it a full career. So, yeah, we can dive more into it from there, but that's really the basics.
Wow. And yes, again, it does lend itself, again, as a fellow brat. And I didn't know that actually before talking with you, and it always makes sense. I can almost detect when I'm speaking to a fellow brat, because we are a different type of breed, not to suggest better or worse, but just a little different. For instance, many brats, as you will have, you can account to that, the hardest question that we can get asked is, where are you from? Because, yeah, especially growing up, because it's, well, do you mean, where was I born, or where did I last come from, or where am I heading? It's a complicated question.
Right.
So you joined the military, and, tell us a little bit about your military career, how it sort of blossomed, when you started in 1997. Just tell us a little bit about your military career.
Well, I think all officers start out with an idea of the things they want to do. And just as a lark, I decided to take the air test to see if I could be a pilot. And the results of that meant that I was actually probably better suited to maybe manage an airfield or fill one up with fuel. So I had to move on to other dreams. And one of the other things was to be actively involved in ground operations. And so I became an infantry officer. I was very much interested in leading troops, leading Marines, being involved in as much as I could at the short period of time that I intended to be in the Marine Corps. And infantry allowed for an adventurous lifestyle, adventurous opportunity, and to take advantage of that. So after infantry training, I was actually moved out to California and assigned to a battalion landing team. It's a battalion-sized element that has a lot of reinforcements. If people are not really familiar with the military, it's just a very large conglomerate unit with all of the attendant battlefield functions, such as artillery and tanks and logistics, all attached in one organization. And then from there, we went out on what's called a Marine Expeditionary Unit. And that was my first deployment, which brought me to East Timor in 2000. And then I was very interested in going from there to the Force Reconnaissance community, which was at that point in time, the Marines' answer to Special Operations Forces. It was and still is a pinnacle unit and assignment to be a part of. A very small community. The small unit aspect of that really interested me. And so I took a selection course and got picked to go and do it, and then didn't look back. So I'll pause for a moment, but that's basically the impetus.
So for those who really don't know much about the military, let's back up just a little bit, because I think this is going to be really interesting as we get into the topics of leadership. Just give, again, people who are not that familiar with the military or the Marines and it's the jargon, what is infantry unit? What going into infantry, what does that mean essentially?
Essentially, you are a ground-based combat organization. So if you think of the people who are at the front end of fighting, they are usually, sometimes they have some vehicles, some mechanical means to transport them. Well, a lot of times they're just walking and moving towards the enemy. And so a lot of the people who are doing fighting in the Ukraine right now are just ground infantrymen. And that's
these are these are the people on the ground doing the fighting,
Yes.
Yes. Whew, Okay. And so then the next assignment after the infantry, say again that you went out to California. What is their basic function?
The basic function of the battalion is to actually bring a lot more of, in this case, I was an infantry battalion. So the entire battalion, was about 600 people, would be brought to bear as a maneuver unit as part of a larger combat strategic answer in a combat scenario.
I see. So
it's a big block. It's inside of a kind of a very large corporation if you look at it like that.
Yeah. And they bring, again, the infantry, but then when you come with this battalion, they bring a lot, the bigger goods, right?
Well, the point
like
in
time
the way we were organized after that, yes, we had a lot of attachments and things working together to form what's called a ground combat element, which allows for self-sustaining operations. And in our case, in the Marine Corps, you're working generally from amphibious basing to fight ashore. So you want to be able to fight compositely and independently and interdependently on the ground.
Wow.
It's a pretty complex scenario.
Yes, no, I can imagine, and that's what also brings the unique understanding of leadership and frankly, yes, what's kind of happening in Ukraine, trying to understand that a little bit more as well. And so then refresh my memory. After that, you went into special operations.
I went into the Marine Reconnaissance community, which was.
And tell us about that. What do they do?
So they do operations ahead of friendly lines, generally. Reconnaissance being the primary function to find and not only locate the enemy, but then maintain contact with. That doesn't mean necessarily fight them, but definitely have an understanding of their location to then either call in an airstrike or help the commanders make better decisions on how to address the enemy in front of them. Reconnaissance is a supremely important part of warfighting. And then the people who are entrusted to do it have to be very, very capable, and they also have to there's a heck of a lot of trust that goes into what they're able to do.
So when you say capable, and I have some thoughts in mind, but I'm not going to feed them to you. When you say they have to be capable, what do you mean by that? Specifically, capable in doing what?
Well, in this case, if you're going to find the enemy, you have to be careful. You have to be measured. You also have to know that what your permissions are and what you can and can't do. So those are all capabilities. And then you also have to have the capability to report accurately. You have to be able to use the radios and paint the picture fairly succinctly so that people can make decisions. And then from there, you certainly have a whole host of equipment that you have to be able to use that supports your job. So there's a lot of capabilities that go into it.
Yes, and I can imagine, and that was the thought that was in my head, your ability to look at a situation, and as you just said it, not only communicate it, but communicate it succinctly, right? And so that, again, I couldn't have said it better, that you paint this picture for those who need to or who will make the ultimate decision about what will happen. I assume that you make decisions at that level of reconnaissance, but also, as you said, whether, I can't imagine what goes into making a decision to call in an airstrike and the implications of doing that.
Yes, and therein lies another capability. You have to be able to, from start to finish, manage how you're actually going to prosecute, implement the weapons that the aircraft is carrying against the target set. And then you also, we really try and train people, particularly at the lower leadership level, not only that we have a high amount of trust in them, but that they're able to recognize situations. We call it recognitional decision making. You recognize the situation and apply your judgment against it, and that the decision is going to lead to the appropriate outcome. There's a tremendous amount of trust that goes into that, and that's a foundational piece. particularly in the reconnaissance community.
I can imagine, and again, maybe once you're there at that level, making these sorts of decisions or putting your eyes on the enemy and trying to, I guess you could say, ascertain the situation. The pressure must be, I don't know. I mean, maybe by the time you get to this point that the pressure is not as much there. But again, from my standpoint, perhaps from people sitting here watching this, they think, wow, the pressure to get that right must be enormous.
Well, sure. There's also a high amount of trust that you earn in order to go out and accomplish those tasks that are given to you.
Yes.
There is an old saying by a German general I will get wrong. I want to say it was von Moltke, and it is do it differently, even if it's the same. So there's something to be said for repetition. There's something to be able to be said for a baseline of experience. But I think in these cases, it can be very dangerous to make some assumptions that will actually take away that decision-making space. And so you really have to look at these decisions or these situations individually. You may have parallels, you may have things that are absolutely aligned to things that you understand, but it helps to get a holistic picture. Sometimes you don't have all that much time and you have to address those things very quickly. So I agree with you that has to happen. But the person you're sending out there is generally fairly seasoned. The leadership is well established. And then once I was in the reconnaissance community, that in 2006, that then led to the formation of MARSOC, and I was an entry level, so it was called a plank owner, a founding member of that organization. So I went directly from the reconnaissance community into a fledgling and now it's 16 years old special operations organization. So it's quite an interesting transition to take all that experience and put it against a different set of problems.
Wow. So, okay. So then, I feared this would happen in this interview because for every word that comes out of your mouth, I have 10 questions and I just can't even keep track of them in my own head. So I'm just going to keep moving along here. Okay. So then you move into this special operations. Now tell folks, just generally, what is special operations? What does that mean? Special ops, right? What does that mean, just generally speaking?
In general terms, it is very specific, focused operations that the military executes that other services, that other service providers, like the Marine Corps or the Army, the standard line infantry or line units within the Army, cannot effectively do or will not do as well. So special operations is indeed a specialized operation, specialized troops put against very specific mission requirements. So that's in its biggest sense. More specifically, and I just say this because it is part of a larger military machine. Special operations has enjoyed a great deal of popularity in its application and the things that it has accomplished over the last 20 years or so. But it's certainly part of a larger military machine, even though the mission is very important. It's actually fairly small compared to, going out into things that the Army or the Marine Corps or perhaps the Air Force or even, the Navy can do.
Yes, and each have their own. No, please.
I was just saying, does that help answer?
That helps. No, it does. No, it does. And I want to ask you about yours because I think most, people didn't know as much, a couple of decades ago, but now, of course, we think of special ops, we think of SEAL teams or the Green Berets or, even, and actually less known, but, pararescue, under the Air Force. But I think even less known is the special operations that falls under the Marines. I think when we think about Marines, we think of that amphibious warfare. They come up, from the beach and then they take on. So tell us about the special ops that you were involved with. What is that?
Well, I'll just go back very quickly in that you're right. There is a very established hierarchy, or at least established units within the special operations community. Certainly, Army Green Berets or Special Forces are extremely well known. The SEALs have got a very developed and storied culture. Air Force Pararescue and their combat
controllers,
combat controllers. Yes, I was just going to say, And use another acronym trying to to avoid that.
I've almost forgotten all this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So, and they're pilots for that matter. The Air Force have some
Yes.
very, very capable special operations pilots. So then, at the time that MARSOC, Marine Special Operations Command, was stood up, was to augment and assist with the further expansion of Special Operations Command, which is kind of its own component within the military services. It's not its own service, but it's certainly a component.
Sure. Absolutely.
To be able to allow the Marine Corps to fight more jointly, although the Marine Corps is focused very much on joint, meaning working with other services in combat environments. So MARSOC's contribution to that, while small, brought at the point in time a tremendous focus of very directed combat operations in both, primarily in Afghanistan, but it then later branched out around the world. So there are overlaps within each of the special operations as far as what kind of missions they can do, whether that's parachuting, shooting, whether that being a sniper or even subsurface scuba type operations, diving operations. Each of those services have the ability to contribute to that in some capacity. But MARSOC's main focus was being able to work quickly and across various services requirements, or I should say SOCOM's requirements, to help augment various service requirements within
SOCOM being
Special Operations Command.
Yes, just for our audience. And MARSOC, what is that acronym?
Marine Special Operations Command.
Okay. So very, very good, because again, we have a lot of listeners that and I actually didn't know what MARSOC stood for as well, but in any event. So Ivan, can you briefly maybe just, and I'm drilling down here because honestly, I want people to understand the depth and the type of work you did and why this lends itself to such a unique leadership, understanding of leadership, self-leadership, and organizational leadership, if you will, team leadership. So maybe can you just tell one story, if you wouldn't mind, about what you did as a special operator? Maybe just one scenario, even if you just gave us an example of it.
I think the best, maybe not just one scenario, but I think the best way to illustrate the breadth and depth of kind of how you could be employed, or particularly, although my case was a little unique, but I'm not that much different than some of the other peers, not only within MARSOC, but also that I served within Special Operations Command from other services.
Yes.
But in my situation, I worked at every level, whether I was an individual as part of a small team, either as a member or a leader, and that could have been anything from me and one other person to 4 to 6 people.
Interesting.
To then leading organizations that had 45 people, 120 people, and then eventually the largest group of people that I led, some would say managed, was more than 600 in an area larger than the size of West Virginia. And I was responsible for all of their logistics and support requirements, understanding their morale and well-being, being a leader in a distributed environment, which later on we can talk about how that would lend itself to a organization that finds itself kind of as it did after COVID, where they're having to do a lot of the distributed, having a lot of conversations in distributed environments. And then I also worked on staffs. So think of within organizations that were sometimes as large as 5,000 people, and I had to be a functioning member of that. And sometimes it was, anything along those scales. Those are the types of missions and types of tasks that I might be assigned. So
That's incredible.
We could dive down into other parts of that, if you will, but that's really gives you an idea of kind of the scope of the things that I was involved with.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. That's really, again, just even as a veteran, I mean, just fascinating to me that as I think about what you've done, and in the context of wartime as well, which brings a whole, as we all can know and imagine, a whole different perspective to these sorts of things. So that was perfect. So let me just ask, and I want my audience to know that I didn't send Ivan questions. We didn't, we kind of said, okay, let's talk about this, that, and the other. It was a short conversation, but these are just all raw. And so we said, we're just going to chat. And so I'm going to start off by just asking the following. When you think about leadership, just generally speaking, what do you find as the most important characteristics for an effective leader? What comes to your mind when you think about leadership, being a good leader?
Being sure in your decisions, but that takes a lot. There's a lot that takes you to get to that, and that's trusting your subordinates, understanding situations. You do have to have empathy. You do have to have a baseline of experience, and also a bit of intuition. They say it's an art, less a science, but I think there's a science behind leadership. Otherwise, there wouldn't be so many books out there, and there wouldn't be so many people to talk to people about how to be effective at it. I've certainly seen very bad examples, even within elite units of leadership that probably could have been a lot better. And then I've seen people that I honestly didn't think were going to probably amount to much, and that's my own judgment. Step forward and really prove that they could do things. So I don't think you underestimate anybody else. But if it comes down to it, leadership is about understanding. Leadership is about appreciating. And the Chinese symbol for general translates to one who grasps. And that's not only the metaphorical understanding, the grasping of the situation, but it's actually because the general in ancient Chinese armies would be riding a horse and would actually have reins from which to grasp and understand, because that's where he commanded from. So I've always kind of liked that. You kind of have to understand and grasp what's in front of you.
Yeah, it just right there lends itself, again, a different understanding of leadership that honestly I'd never really heard before. And this idea of, a leader, learns or understands how to grasp a situation, a human being. That's pretty profound to me. So very good. The other thing, and you mentioned right off the bat about decision making, and I read I don't remember if it was an article in one of your bios or something where you talked about that, one of your superpowers, it might have been the word that you used, was your ability to distill a situation down to the crux of it, and then make a decision. Just tell us a little bit about that. What do you mean by that, distilling a situation down to the crux so that you can make a decision?
I will say this is easier to do when you're the observer. I won't say that I, in a lot of ways, always hit the mark when I was making that decision. What I will say, as far as analytics, I just have the ability to examine things and just try and get through that which doesn't matter and say, here's what the issue is. And if you can focus on the actual piece, keep the main thing, that's an old adage. But if you can get to that, you can actually start building and solving. And that's another thing a leader really needs to do is you're solving, you're building something because someone's asked you to provide options or provide or come up with an alternative to the way things are going. And I've just been able to do that, particularly in complex environments. Some of them are fairly high stakes, and so it's not something to be taken lightly. I try very hard to be good in that analysis. And does that help answer that?
It helps a lot, but from the standpoint that I think about this, and again, I sort of compare what I'm hearing from you, and thinking about people in the private sector and how they come to their conclusions, or they drill things down to the crux. Really, more than that, actually, this idea of being a leader, and that and I know this from the military lifestyle, that to get to that point of what you just suggested about decision making and sort of being able to get down to the crux or the core of an issue, certainly there's intellect involved, certainly there is intuition that's involved, but there's a heck of a lot of training as well right? And that maybe again, anybody that might be here going into a leadership position or brand new in leadership, or by the way, just leading yourself. The way that the military trains leaders is different than the private sector, not just, from the standpoint that there is constant training. Some of the colleges, you probably went to, war colleges and all these other sorts of things. So I guess the question is, for people listening, that are in a leadership role, new, or want to grow as a leader, how do they get to this place? Ivan, I know it's a complicated question, but how does a person grow as a leader? What would you suggest to them to become a better leader in this sense?
Slow down to go fast.
Slow down to go fast.
Let's just look at it as an analogy of skiing. Lots of people have been skiing. Some people are naturally talented at skiing, and they get on skis and they can absolutely do all the things that they want to do. And all of us who aren't look at them and say, wow, that's impressive. Maybe I'll get there one day if that's your desire. You may not have the talent, you may have the inclination, etc., but there are ways, that you could possibly achieve that. And so if you immediately jump on an advanced slope and you've never spent time on skis, you're going to really have a hard time. You might make it through.
Yeah.
And you might survive, if you will, and get away with a few things. But eventually, that's going to catch up, and your technique's not going to be very good, and you're just going to kind of fight your way through it. And skiing may not be enjoyable to you. But if you take your time and you actually enjoy the process of how you're building skills, then that becomes something else that you might enjoy entirely. And so my parallel to that is that in leadership training, there isn't just one item that's going to make you better all the time. You have to look at leadership as kind of a toolbox. You're reaching into things with different layers within that toolbox. Some you want immediately at hand that you use right away, and then there's others you might have to actually get out when it's time to apply it against a specific problem set or requirement, whether that's interpersonal relations or actually working on a complex project. So if you slow down just a little bit and you really examine where you are in that, you probably have enough time to get things done right, even if you don't think you have enough time to do that. And is it worth the cost if you're having to redo everything if you don't pause for that moment? So that's kind of how I examine that.
No, very, very well stated. And I think about things like, and again, as I'm listening to you, I'm relating this to maybe newer leaders that I've worked with, or just sort of emerging leaders. And to your point, that I find there are too many young leaders or new leaders who want to just jump in and make decisions. And I guess I kind of get it, but it's a bit of a, I don't want to diminish anybody's thinking out there, but it's a bit of more of an ego thing, and that they're new at a leader and they're sitting around the conference table and somebody asks, the big boss asks a question, and this new and emerging leader wants to jump out there and throw the answer at them. Where your point is, one is, as you said, slow down to go fast. I think another way to say that is this idea of delayed gratification, right? That it's gratifying to be at the front and make these decisions and these sorts of things. But to your point, you have to learn step by step the different aspects so that, and I'll reflect back to something you said earlier, so that you show up in a reconnaissance situation and have the toolkit, the wherewithal, the intuition that doesn't just like show up. The intuition comes from a depth, correct?
Yes.
A depth of learning and understanding. And so to me, that's one of the big lessons you just taught anybody who's watching this or who may watch this down the road, is that you have to learn and grow and become that thing. You don't just, like you said, and you could learn, you may be forced to make a hard decision and go down that, that black diamond slope without any, and if you survive, you may go, okay, now let me start over because I know what I need to learn.
Well, you're going to learn a lot.
You're going to learn a lot. Yeah. It's going to be painful, but you might learn a lot. But that might be incidental rather than you just being this bold person, saying, okay, I'm only a yellow slope person, but I think I'm going to go ahead and I think I'm ready for the black diamond.
Sure.
Doesn't work that way.
Absolutely.
Very fascinating, really. And I hope folks are picking up. So, let me ask you then about, and I'm just bouncing around here. Again, I have about 100 things to ask you, but we're not going to get it all done. Let me ask you, though, Ivan, about mindset. So you've been in probably pretty heavy-duty combat situations. What have you learned about your mindset or the idea of mindset, about, let's say, your mindset going into maybe a very serious and violent situation, your mindset during the situation, and then maybe the mindset afterwards? But I'll just start with that idea. Your mindset, talk to us about your mindset and how you go into really stressful situations and keep your wits about you. I don't know. There's so many different directions we could go with this.
Yeah. So I will say that probably the most stressful environment that I have faced is definitely combat operations, where you're not only being shot at, but you're shooting back. It's very chaotic, very, very fluid. There's a certain amount of mental preparation you can do, and then there's just certain things that you're going to react to. I think in any situation, you have to examine worst case scenario. You have to examine what's going to happen in that crisis, and then come up with all the contingencies, at least in very simple terms, of how you're going to, you anticipate reacting. Now, everyone's got a plan until you get punched in the mouth.
That's right.
I forget the very sage boxer who said that. But
I don't remember, but yeah.
It might have been Muhammad Ali, but it is the absolute
yeah.
truth. But ultimately, I mean, you have to go in with the mindset that, in my mind, you're going to win. In my mind, that it's going to work out. Yes, things are going to change. You're going to have to make changes. And I've had people get wounded and unfortunately killed in my command that I had to adjust very quickly to, that changed the dynamic of the situation in such a way that I had to then make different kinds of decisions. But the mindset has to be that going into it, it's positive. You have to stay positive. You have to stay focused on the outcome. As soon as you throw your hands in the air and say, oh my God, it's over, we can't do this, that's what's going to happen. And it is imperative as a leader that they maintain stalwart stuff, because there is a little bit of a Hollywood parallel, particularly in the scene, one of the opening scenes in Saving Private Ryan, the opening scene on the beach, where everything turns into slow motion for Tom Hanks, his character. And a soldier looks at him and says, "What now, sir? What are we going to do?" And when somebody does that to you, that's what they're expecting, that you're going to provide that. And so you may or may not be ready. And at that point, you're really going to have to fall back on intuition in making your decisions. If you can stay in control of situations, if you can maintain the pace of things, that makes things a lot easier. So I'm not using this to turn it into some sort of business parallel. What I am saying, though, is in business and in leadership situations, it particularly might be challenging because of a variety of factors. Positive mental attitude, a focus on what your outcomes, how you want those outcomes to look, and then what those results are going to be after the fact. That will carry you an awfully long way. But that takes some time. It also takes something known as introspection, and that being introspective is not just sort of looking at yourself and going, "Why am I the way I am?" That's part of it, but it's really, just looking at your decision-making ability and what it is that you can provide and how you provide it. But ultimately, people want to be led. 85% of the people on the planet are looking for someone to help them. That doesn't mean they want to be told what to do necessarily. There's a difference there, but they would like to be provided the option that someone is going to help them and be effective in doing so as a leader.
Wow. And I always and will resist it here as well to talk about any sort of politics on Grow Yourself, because I just don't like to go there. So I won't, but I would love to hear just your thoughts, because as I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about the Ukrainian president, Zelensky. And here's a man that was a comedian, an actor, who is now the president of a country. But no, not just a president of a country being attacked by one of the greatest nations militarily on the planet. How in the heck, and heck is not the word I wanted to use, but how in the heck, I mean, as a leader, what in the heck does he possibly think and do? It's mind-blowing to watch what he's doing. I mean, certainly there's a lot of admiration for his courage. And it seems to me that, I don't know, I don't even want to speculate about his decision-making skills here. But I mean, I just would love a comment of what you think about him as a leader, good, bad, or ugly. I mean, it's fascinating to hear you talk and then think about a guy who probably isn't ready for this. Who's ready for a war, especially a new president, young, perhaps with not that much experience. I don't know. I'm not sure what to say about him.
Well, ready or not, he's in it.
He's in it.
So I'll pay him. I'll pay him one of the highest compliments that a Marine can pay another one. And I'd work for him. I'd go to war with him.
I would too. So
there's that. So let's look at President Zelensky, and this is just my lens. This is just how I view things. He's a fighter leader. He's a warrior leader. Whether he was born as a warrior, he has got the intrinsic traits to lead, from the front. He sends a positive message. He's telling his people to stay positive in the face of enormous odds. That goes back to the mindset piece that I was talking about.
Yes.
It helps that he's charismatic. It helps that he does have a bit of media savvy because of his background.
Yes.
And he is the right man for the job. He is the right man in the right place. What I love is that, I'm going to say something that is not, I don't mean it to be political, but it is a comment on our foreign policy. The United States has a fairly substantiated track record of when things go bad in countries we support. And this has happened in Haiti. It happened in Iran in 1979.
Yeah.
We grab the leader that we support and like. It also happened in the 50s in multiple countries in Central America, going back, quite a number of years, to grab that leader and say, hey, we will get you out of here. We'll bring you to safety. You can live in the United States. You'll still lead. You'll still be the recognized leader of the country, but we'll get you out of there. And when he said, I don't need a ride, I need ammo.
That blew my mind. Yeah.
Oh, I love it. And the other thing about him that I really enjoyed, this is another quote. I'm talking about this guy as if I know him. And God, all things being fair, maybe one day I get to have lunch with him. I would love to.
Sure.
I think I'd be at the line of a very long queue.
Very long line. Yes.
But he also told his cabinet members. He told the people he was governing and that's another thing I like to say is, you may work for me, but we work together. And when I meet people's wives, when I meet their spouses, I say, we work together, me and this person, me and so and so. So I think what I really liked is he said, hey, we're a team, but I don't want you to put a picture of me on the wall. I want you to put pictures of your family around your office. And when you make a decision, you're doing it on, it's going to drive your conscience. It's going to drive your decision to be the positive one. And that's an amazing thing, because I don't know a lot of people in any sort of government, I know plenty of leaders who have pictures of their family in there, but I'm not sure they're using that for the gravitas of their decision making. And quite frankly, in some of the situations that I was involved in, there wasn't moments where I was pausing going, I'm wondering, what so-and-so's up to today. You have to stay very focused on that. So this guy's got this layered, very complex character that's another facet of leadership, if we're talking about it, that is just a fabulous example on display. I'm impressed. I hope the guy deserves all the support we can give him in more opinion.
Yeah, boy, that's just so fascinating. I appreciate that you really tied all of this up into the idea of leadership and mindset. The other thing I did want to ask just about that, and maybe not so much about Zelensky, but I imagine he's got to find himself in this situation that, as a leader in a situation, you kind of were speaking about this earlier, as a leader in a situation where we'll say like Zelensky, who probably wasn't ready, but you said, there he is though, and now he has to make decisions, very hard decisions. At what point as a leader in these sort of crisis situations do you, on the one hand, you don't know everything, or maybe you're new, you're finding yourself in this situation and don't have the answers, and somebody turns to you and say, what should we do now? At what point do you really try to collaborate with the people around you instead of, like making up an answer? Because I've heard leaders say this, I feel like, they're looking for the answer, so I need to give them something. And one of my thoughts is to say, well, listen, unless you think you have all the answers, there's a lot of people working with, around, and for you that can contribute to the right answer. I'm not entirely sure what the question is there, but at what point do you sort of allow yourself to be somewhat vulnerable in your thinking and reach out to the people around you to help come up with the right decision?
Well, let's look at the three hardest words for a leader to say. I don't know.
No.
Zelensky has no problem saying that, and then he turns to his people and says, "What should we do? Or what can you offer?" Vladimir Putin never says, "I don't know," and he reaches out to his people and bashes them and says, "How come this is happening?" There's your difference.
Perfect. Just in a word, there it was. That was just really just a great answer, I guess you could say. So, by the way, I did note that you're a guitar player, and so we're fellow guitar players. I'll ask you about that in a minute. Let me just look at the time here. So, the other things like where does self-awareness play in your life, Ivan? In the past or even now? What credence do you lend to self-awareness as a human being, as a leader, whatever?
Oh, I try and be very self-aware. It also probably lends to being very highly self-critical. That probably the bad side of that, if you will. There's good and bads to each side.
Very good. Yes.
I think I try and be aware of the decisions that I'm making and how my decisions affect people. They're just empathetic in some regard, or try and be empathetic in most regards. But in some regards that you kind of have to make a quick decision that may not always be the most popular one, even if someone's frustrated. But I do try and do a lot of self-analysis. I spend every morning I do some sort of stretching and yoga and meditation to kind of center myself for the day and think about the decisions I make. I think, or might make. I think the bigger problem is we call it rumination after the fact, where you're analyzing your decisions and you're looking at things. When they go well, you tend to replay the things that have really gone well, and when they go bad, I tend to kind of beat myself up over it. And there comes a point in time where you kind of have to let things go. And I admit that I am not that good at that. I'm not that good at that self-forgiveness, but definitely self-awareness for a leader, very, very important.
Wow, man, I didn't expect that. That's so good from the standpoint that what you just described is something that I talk about from time to time. The idea of a person who wants to win, who loves to win, and it drives them. But then the implications of a person who wants to win too much, you see, and not being aware, or let's just say a person who's very confident. As a leader, I'd want a leader to be confident, but then if they're too confident, then you don't see them really as confident anymore. You see them as cocky, or let's just say I'd love to have on my team really super smart people. Honestly, genuinely, I want people that are smarter than me. But then there's that person who always has to be the smartest person in the room. And it changes from being super smart and respected to something that goes off the scales. And I think I heard you say the same thing about self-awareness. That self-awareness is good, but to be overly self-aware, yes, you become highly critical of yourself, which doesn't in the end pay off. We should be self-critical. We should look at ourselves and say, things like, well, let me not preach here. Let me ask you. It's important to be self-critical, right? But then too self-critical becomes what?
It can actually be detrimental. It'll actually make you second guess the decisions you make in a lot of ways.
Wow.
And then you become what I think is actually a very, well, they're very difficult to work for. In my line of work, it was dangerous for the ones who couldn't make decisions or they made poor decisions because of this thought that in a lot of ways it was very hesitant. There was in some cases there were cultures created that leaders didn't have to do anything right so long as they didn't do anything wrong, and they just stayed away from making
Wow.
really tough things, and then that actually endangered the people around them, believe it or not. And I won't get into like hyper specifics on that, but that in general terms,
Right.
I've seen that in a couple of ways. That's where it can go to the extreme. And then the other side of self-awareness certainly becomes narcissism, self-love.
Yes.
Which then turns into self-loathing. And I'm not a psychologist, but I grew up with one, so I kind of have an idea of how that shakes out as well. So yeah, I think there's just a thin line, honestly, a balancing act to stay on that line of being a self-aware, self-critiquing leader who understands the impacts of their decisions, who also can appreciate why he's making a decision and how that might be received. And if you can keep all that together and maintain a positive mental attitude and smile while you're doing it, people might just like you and want to keep going. So hopefully that works.
Wow. That's wow, fascinating to hear that. So I have just a couple more questions in the time that we have. A couple of quotes that you made that I really found fascinating, and one of them was you said to have patience for the process. We will get there. I don't know, where did that come from, or what does that mean? Just beyond I think we can all kind of figure out what it means, but what is your thinking there, Ivan, about that? Have patience for the process.
It goes back to you made the comment earlier in the show here that there's an instant gratification piece, and we live in an environment now where that's easier than ever. Whether we admit it or not, we're all addicted to our phones, and we require them. The whole reason podcasts exist is so that people can fill time and hopefully gain something, but they're always engaged.
Yes, no doubt.
That was one thing I also try and do in my everyday life is find time to disengage and not be on my computers and devices, and be present with the people around me, whether that's having lunch or dinner. We all eat with our phones on the table. That's distracting. And just kind of, when you're sipping a beer, enjoy the taste of the beer. And actually while you're out there, we live in a harried world. So when I was a lieutenant, yes, you were expected to come into some of these staff situations. You're expected to come in as a leader, and you make that decision, and you're going to move right away and get that done. And then when that's accomplished, you can check it off the list. I love checklists. I love putting those things together. You may not get everything done the way you want it to, and it may not happen at that point in time. And there's something I've learned over the last couple of years as I've started to off ramp or come down from being in the military. I'm still learning it, but I came up with have patience for the process, because I found that these things that I was looking to go and do were happening at a different pace than I could control or even understand. And so I had to have patience for that process. And eventually I would get to wherever I was going. If you're in a traffic jam, you can be mad as can be. No one likes sitting in traffic. Heck, I don't like traffic lights, but you're there and you got to deal with it. And if you did, I admit that I am a guy who's had to work on his patience. There's plenty of people who I know who will watch this podcast and be like, Ivan Ingram, patience.
Amen to that.
Yeah, it's something I have to work at, and it's back to self-awareness. It's something I struggle with, but I do try and understand that that's where I'm coming from, and so that if I'm patient for whatever the process happens to be, and that can happen also in business, you will eventually reach your goal. But you've got to slow down to go fast. You've got to be able to recognize that sometimes this is where you're going to go. And like with music, I'm not a savant guitar player. It takes me a long time to learn parts, and I have to learn starts. I'd love to be able to play In the Beginning by Emerson, Lake and Palmer the right way, but right now I'm just barely hanging on to how they did that.
Yeah. Wow. That's interesting. It's refreshing and impressive. I think that even a military vet, and I've been around Marines. I was in the embassy scenario and often saw the incredible Marines that guarded the embassies and so forth. And, even I think of Marines as just hard charging, impatient, just go in there, kick everybody's ass and be done with it. It's a stereotypical view, but to hear, not only.
I think if you knew me when I was 26, you probably wouldn't have.
Okay, fair enough, fair enough. But honestly, to hear a veteran, and I look at special ops people as I just refer to them as badasses because you do things that are badass. But to hear you talk about, slowing down, being patient, even this idea of disconnecting from all of these things that drive us, it's quite frankly is refreshing. My mentor, you may be familiar with Marshall Goldsmith. I met him several years ago in 2008, and he was doing a speech up in New York City at the National Speakers Association, and he came out. If people don't know him, Marshall Goldsmith, he's really just an icon in the world of leadership and executive coach and so forth. But he came out, and I think I didn't know who he was at the time, and many people thought, we just looked up to him because he was a thought leader in leadership and this, that, and the other. And he came out, and in a polo shirt and khakis, and said, "Hey, I want to ask you all a question. How do you become a better leader? How do you know how to do that?" And there's 1,200 people in the audience throwing out all these fancy answers. A bunch of coaches and consultants and speakers, and and he was graciously saying, "Yeah, okay, keep going." And then finally he came around to this answer. He said, it's not that all of those are wrong. He said, but if you want to know how to become a better leader, he said the answer is simple. Go ask your people. Go ask your employees. They'll tell you. And what was interesting, and he also posed it this way. He said, simply walk up to your employees tomorrow morning and say, Ivan, how can I be a better leader for you? He said it in those simple terms. So here's what's interesting. Several days later, when I got home, I'm sitting in my home office, and my youngest daughter, Alexandra, came into my office to say hi after she got home. And I said, Alexandra, I got a question for you. And she was only probably 10 or 11, I'm thinking at the time. And so she sat down in a chair, and I said, I got an important question for you. I said, Alexandra, how can I be a better dad for you? And you kind of have to know her to realize what her answer would be. And she's fairly matter of fact. And she goes, Dad, let me think about that for a second. And she literally sat there going like this. She said, I got one for you. How about when I come home and come in to say hi to you and maybe talk to you for a second, that you don't do this? Oh, hi, Alexandria. Yeah, okay. And I'm typing on my computer. Yeah, you had a good day? Good. She said, if you didn't do that, you'd be a better dad. And I just almost fell out of my chair.
Out of the mouths of babes.
Yes, that's right. And it's kind of to your point about disengaging, being more present, that, it changed me as a dad. I don't do it perfectly, but her point was to just disconnect from that for a second and be present with me. And so again, to hear, a special operator, if you will, a Marine of 24 years, to say that, I think is really refreshing, especially as we talk about this in the context of self-awareness, leadership, self-leadership, and all those other sorts of things. I just appreciate it. Absolutely. So I just want to ask one more question, and which will lead me to the perhaps the final question, and that is that you said that the future in one of your posts, I think it was a post that you made on LinkedIn as you were getting out of the military, and I'll just read it for the audience because I think it's a very nice post in the moment of the time of a Marine Corps officer who's just getting out of the 24 years of service, in the Marine Corps and special operations, in fighting wars, also the son of a military person. You said this, I was never happier when I was doing things like I am in this photograph, and it's showing you in combat situation. it was taken
maybe
long.
I have thrill issues. Maybe I have thrill issues, but or good.
It said it was taken long ago in combat while serving with great Americans. I will never be so lucky again. You said today, after 24 years in the Corps, I hung up the gun belt for good. Mixed emotions, doesn't describe it. I loved my job and with whom I got to do it. You said the military didn't disappoint right up to the last day. After a final endurance event, a lesson in patience with my DD-214, which is a new ID card, and DD-214 is the document that you get from the military saying, okay, you're done. With a new ID card in hand, I am on to the next chapter. I am excited by the prospects, but then you said this, the future is always perfect. What did you mean by that? The future is always perfect.
I think that people say for the foreseeable future. Well, that's a double negative. You know, you can make future plans. You can have future ideas. You certainly have to have hope for things in your future. It's perfect because you can make it any which way you want. You can envision it any which way you want, and then you sort of set that as a goal and go after it. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but there's nothing but opportunity out there. I can't take credit for that quote. Now that I think about it, I probably need to go back and amend that, because if I remember reading correctly, it was in a book that I'd read while I was in the service called Inside Delta Force by Eric Haney. He was a sergeant major in that unit. And I think he put that in one of his chapters, where the future is always perfect. And so that just hit me as I was sitting here, and I heard you reread that.
Yeah, I mean, you didn't claim it as your quote, but you quote it, but you said it is beautiful. No,
it's always stuck with me, and I think there's nothing but opportunity out there, and you've got to have an idea of what you want to achieve, and then go after it.
I mean, just really so beautifully said. And so I will ask you, sort of as my final question, is what is your next chapter? What is your perfect future in the short term, or perhaps in the long term? You know, tell us what you're up to, what you do, what you're going to be doing.
I am trying to keep on this path where I have a lot of freedom of action and ability to do the things that I like to do. And also, my why statement, I'm a big fan of Simon Sinek. I understood with Start With Why. My why statement is to lead with purpose so that others maximize their potential. And so I set up a small LLC called IFI Solutions. Those are my initials. And my goal is to get out there and help impart what maybe a little wisdom and perspective I have to, whether it's individuals or organizations, and keynote speaking or coaching, etc. I'm still exploring all of this space. If it sounds a little disjointed, it's probably because I'm brand new to kind of what direction I want to go. But I'm very happy in the space that I'm in. I'm happy with the direction I'm going. I'm also a writer, and I like telling stories, and I like getting together with people to tell stories. It's one of the reasons I love music, because a lot of music tells stories. I think, though, I mean, like I said, I'm as a writer. I'm working on different articles at this point in time. I've been published in Task and Purpose. I'm talking with them about more future articles, which we're working on at this moment. I've got a novel that I've been plugging away on for a number of years, and I've written a couple of short films and writing another, and I've got 2 screenplays that I've been also tapping away at to get them moving somewhere. So maybe I want to be an entertainer on a more mellow level. But if Adam Driver wants to have a conversation marine to marine about what it's like to be in the entertainment industry, I wouldn't be upset. But ultimately, I think I'm just trying to move forward in a direction that I think is positive, and maybe impart some of this stuff to people. That's really what I want to do.
Well, listen, the proof is in the pudding, not just for your accomplishments, but anybody sitting here listening to you for the last hour, it's just, and again, I have to say, this was completely unscripted, but to hear all the wisdom and the ideas and the notions that you have, people ought to, pick up the phone right now and call you and say, hey, come help us, be better leaders, or whatever the case might be. So I congratulate you for, continuing that path. And as a fellow musician, you're a guitar player, right? And, Nashville, here we are. I'm in Nashville, so come on, and
Yeah,
let's write some songs together.
I'd love to come out there. We'll play off the strip there. But,
Off. Yes.
Right. Maybe
Yeah.
a campfire, in the KOA or something. But either way,
but either way,
I played Nashville.
But you can claim that you played Nashville, yes,
Absolutely.
albeit around a fire pit. That's all good. Well, listen, Ivan, how can people be in touch with you? How can they get a hold of you? What's the best way to do that?
So I am on LinkedIn, Ivan F. Ingram. I'm probably the only one on there that I've seen. I'm also available via Gmail, ivan.f.ingraham@gmail.com. I don't have a website running just yet. That is one of the things that we got on the to-do list.
Absolutely.
And that's just the easiest way to start having a conversation.
Yes.
And that's how I think great relationships start, is you just have a conversation, and they can reach out to me via those two means. And then from there, we can
Perfect.
exchange numbers if people want to have a longer.
And I will make sure that all of that, which you just said, is in the show notes. And just to make sure that people understand that your last name is spelled Ingraham as
Yep.
Ingram. And so, well, listen, I can't thank you enough. This was, as high as my expectations were about this conversation, you still exceeded them. And I just appreciate you taking the time. And again, thank you so much for your service. And, just thank you so very much.
It's absolutely my pleasure. It's a topic I'm passionate about. I think we could take it in many different directions. I thank you for your service. I thank you for your continued support, certainly to fellow veterans, and also, your own robust body of work, I think, speaks for itself. So the fact that you asked me to come on your podcast and be a part of this is, as I said, it's humbling, and it's been an absolutely fantastic opportunity. So thank you. This has been great.
Listen, the pleasure is completely mine. I look forward to staying in touch. God bless you, Ivan Ingram, Lieutenant Colonel Ivan Ingram. We'll be in touch and look forward to talking to you again.
Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.